The morning Ellen Turner stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1873, every man on that dusty main street stopped what he was doing to stare, and not one of them believed she would last a month. She was 26 years old, dressed in a practical gray traveling dress that was already stained with the red dust of the Oklahoma Territory, and she carried in her right hand a leather satchel containing every dollar she owned in this world, $432, earned over 7 years of working as a seamstress in Cincinnati, Ohio. In her left hand she carried a rolled-up deed to 160 acres of Kansas land, purchased sight unseen through a land office advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette. She had no husband. She had no family within 1,000 miles. She had only a plan, a stubbornness that her mother used to call a gift from the devil, and the absolute refusal to die quietly in some back room stitching other people's fancy clothing until her eyes gave out. The men on the street watched her walk into the general store run by a man named Harold Potts, who was round-faced and suspicious of strangers and particularly suspicious of women traveling alone. He looked at her deed. He looked at her. He looked at the deed again. "You bought the Haggerty parcel," he said, as though she had told him she intended to fly to the moon. "I bought 160 acres of Kansas land, yes," Ellen said. "I would like to purchase supplies." "Miss, what did you say your name was?" "Turner, Ellen Turner." Harold Potts scratched the back of his neck. "Miss Turner, that land is 40 minutes east of town. It's got a creek that floods in spring and dries up in summer. The last man who tried to work it packed up and left inside of 2 years." "Then he was not sufficiently motivated," Ellen said pleasantly. "I would like flour, salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, a good knife, a hammer, nails, and whatever seeds you have left that are appropriate for late spring planting. I also need to know where I can hire a wagon." Harold Potts stared at her for a long moment, then slowly began moving around his store collecting her order, shaking his head the entire time. While he measured out flour into a cotton sack, 3 other men drifted into the store, not because they needed anything, but because word had traveled down the street that a lone woman had bought the Haggerty parcel and seemed to mean it. One of the men was named Roy Decker, who fancied himself the authority on everything in Caldwell, Kansas, and he leaned against the doorframe with his thumbs in his belt loops and gave Ellen a look she had seen 1,000 times before, the look that said she was something slightly less than capable. "Word of advice, Miss Turner," Roy Decker said. "That land out east is no place for a woman alone. There's been trouble with cattle drives cutting through. The soil is hard as iron before you break it, and the nearest neighbor is Lawson spread, and he is not what you would call a welcoming man." Ellen picked up a seed packet of winter wheat and turned it over in her hands. "Then I suppose I will not need him to be welcoming," she said. "I will need him to stay on his own land." The men in the store exchanged glances. Roy Decker laughed, and it was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had already decided how a story ended. Ellen paid for her supplies. She hired a wagon from a man named Pete Gruber who had a tobacco-stained beard and an honest face, and as he loaded her things into the wagon bed, he looked at her with something that was closer to concern than mockery. "That Lawson," Pete Gruber said quietly, handing her up onto the wagon seat. "He is not a bad man. Just lost his wife 2 winters ago and has kept to himself since. You might find he is more reasonable than Roy Decker makes out." "I appreciate that," Ellen said. Pete Gruber clicked his tongue at the horses and they rolled east out of Caldwell, into the wide, flat, terrifying beauty of the Kansas plain. Ellen had read about this land. She had looked at drawings in magazines. She had talked to a man who had been out here in 1865. None of it had prepared her for the actual scale of the sky, which was so enormous and so blue it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. The grass was still that tender spring green, bending in long, slow waves under the southern wind, and the horizon went on forever in every direction. There were no trees except along the creek beds, just this endless rolling ocean of grass, and for one single unguarded moment, Ellen felt the fear she had been carefully not feeling for 3 months rise up in her throat like floodwater. She breathed through it. She looked at the grass. She thought about the sewing room in Cincinnati, where she had spent 7 years bent over other people's gowns, and she decided that fear was considerably preferable to that, and she lifted her chin and kept her eyes on the horizon. They reached her land 40 minutes later, just as Pete Gruber had said. He pulled up at a small stake in the ground with a ribbon of faded red cloth tied to it, the marker the land office had put in, and they both looked out over the acres that were now hers. There was no house. There was no barn. There was no well. There was a shallow creek running along the east boundary, barely more than a muddy trickle in spring, though she could see by the high watermark on the cottonwood trees along its bank that it ran much fuller in wet seasons. There was a slight rise in the land about 200 yards from the creek, high enough to build on without fear of flooding, she noted, and there were the ruins of a dugout that the previous occupant had evidently abandoned, just a low earthen depression with 2 half-rotted timber supports and a rusted tin roof lying at an angle in the grass. "You sure about this?" Pete Gruber asked. "Yes," Ellen said. It was not entirely true, but it was the only useful answer. Pete helped her unload her supplies near the ruins of the dugout, tipped his hat, said he hoped she would manage well, and drove back toward Caldwell. Ellen stood alone in the Kansas grass, listening to the wagon sounds fade away until there was only the wind and the birds and the enormous silence of the frontier. She stood there for exactly 60 seconds. Then she picked up her hammer and began to assess what she had. The first 3 days were the hardest days of her life. She repaired the dugout enough to sleep in it. The earthen walls were still solid, which was something, and she managed to re-angle the tin roof so it would shed rain. She dug out the interior, laid her bedroll on a wooden pallet she constructed from pieces of the rotted timber, and spent the first night lying on her back in the dark listening to sounds she could not identify and refusing to let herself imagine what made them. On the second day she walked the full boundary of her land, pacing it out. She found the creek. It was indeed running low, barely 4 inches deep but clear, and she located a spot where it pooled a little deeper behind a flat rock and decided that was her water source for now. She found on the far western edge of her property the fence line of her neighbor. It was a good fence, solid cedar posts, 3 strands of wire, well-maintained. Louis Lawson's land. She noted that the fence was in better repair than the rest of everything around here, which told her something about the man. On the 3rd day she planted her kitchen garden in the dark, turned earth near the dugout, and began the calculations she had been working on in her head since Cincinnati. She needed a real house. Not a sod house. The dugout was tolerable as a temporary shelter, but she had not come to Kansas to live in a hole in the ground. She needed a proper frame house, and to get a proper frame house, she needed lumber, and lumber meant money, and money meant she needed to find work in Caldwell while simultaneously working her land, and working her land meant she needed to make the soil produce something she could sell. It was an enormous problem, and she worked it in her mind the way she worked a difficult piece of sewing, methodically, patiently, 1 seam at a time. On the 4th morning she was down at the creek with her wash bucket when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find a man on a dark bay horse stopped at the fence line, looking at her. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or 2 more. Broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with a face that had been weather-darkened to the color of old oak and a jaw that had not been shaved in several days. He wore a plain work shirt, canvas trousers, boots that had been good once and were still serviceable, and a hat that had seen considerable weather. He sat his horse with the easy stillness of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not quite a frown and not quite anything else she could name. "You are on the Haggerty parcel," he said. It was not a question. "It is the Turner parcel now," Ellen said, not getting up from where she was crouching by the creek. I am Ellen Turner, and you must be Louis Lawson. Something shifted in his face. Who told you my name? Several people in Caldwell. All of them told me different things about you, which means I will have to form my own opinion. He was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he said, "You are alone out here." "I am. That is not wise." "Neither is staying somewhere you are miserable," Ellen said. "But people do it all the time. I chose not to." She stood up and picked up her bucket. "Were you coming to introduce yourself, or just to inform me of things I already know?" For a moment she thought she had pushed too far. He was not a man who smiled easily, she could see that in the set of his mouth, but something moved behind his eyes, and it was not hostility. "Your fence post on the south corner is rotting," he said. "It will fall inside a month." "Thank you," Ellen said. He looked at her dugout. He looked at her small stack of supplies near the entrance. He looked at her garden, which was laid out in careful, straight rows. He said nothing else, turned his horse, and rode back across his land. Ellen watched him go and thought that Pete Gruber had been right. He was not a bad man. Over the following 2 weeks, she learned the rhythms of the land, and they were not gentle rhythms. The Kansas plain in May was beautiful and indifferent, and it required everything she had every single day. She woke before dawn, carried water from the creek, tended her garden, worked at repairing and improving the dugout, and spent her afternoons walking the acreage trying to understand what it was capable of. The soil in the lower fields was rich and dark river-bottom soil, she realized, deposited over years by the flooding she had been warned about, and she began to understand that the flooding was not only a problem, but also part of why the land could be productive if she managed it correctly. She had been reading about farming. She had borrowed 5 books from the Cincinnati Public Library and read them all twice on the stagecoach journey. She knew the theory of it. The practice was harder, rougher, and more physically demanding than any theory had suggested, and at the end of every day she lay on her pallet in the dugout with muscles that ached in ways she had not known muscles could ache, and she stared at the earthen ceiling and thought about her house. She could see it clearly in her mind. She had been drawing it in a small notebook for years. A proper frame house, 2 stories with a wide front porch, glass windows, a real kitchen with a good iron stove, wooden floors, a parlor, 3 bedrooms. It was the kind of house that said to everyone who looked at it that the person inside it had not merely survived, but had flourished. She had planned it the way other women plan their weddings. She had planned it with the careful love of someone who had never had a real home and intended to build one herself. She had shown those drawings to her cousin Margaret in Cincinnati, just before she left, and Margaret had looked at them and then looked at Ellen with genuine worry on her face. "Ellen," Margaret had said, "you cannot build a house by yourself. You do not know how, and the frontier is no place for a woman without a husband. They will eat you alive out there." Ellen had folded up her drawings carefully and put them back in her satchel. "Then I suppose I had better make sure they do not get the chance," she had said. She thought about that conversation often in those first weeks. She thought about it when her hands blistered and bled from unfamiliar work, when she misjudged a water level and nearly lost her kitchen garden to standing water after a heavy rain, when the wind came up one night so fierce it tore half the tin roof off the dugout, and she spent 3 hours in the dark trying to secure it with rope. She thought about it, and she thought about Margaret's face, which had worn the expression of a woman attending a funeral for someone who did not yet know they were going to die. The thought made her work harder. It was Louis Lawson who showed up the morning after the windstorm. She was up on the low roof of the dugout with her rope and a hammer, still in her night braid, wearing her oldest dress, and she heard the horse before she saw him. He rode up to the edge of her property and looked at the roof situation and then looked at her. "You need better anchoring," he said. "That tin will never hold with rope alone." "I am aware of that," Ellen said, driving a nail and wincing when the hammer glanced off and she struck her own thumb. "I need iron strapping, and I do not have any." He looked at her a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away without another word, and she thought, well, that was that. But 40 minutes later he came back, and over his saddle he had a roll of iron strapping and a proper tin-punch tool. He did not ask her permission. He dismounted, tied his horse to the cottonwood by the creek, and climbed up beside her on the dugout roof with the calm efficiency of a man who had fixed 1,000 things over the course of his life. They worked side by side in near silence for an hour, securing the roof with the strapping, and when they were done it was solid as Ellen had ever felt anything. She sat back on her heels and looked at his profile. "What do I owe you for the strapping?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I will not accept charity." He looked at her then, and his eyes were a very dark gray, the color of a sky just before serious weather. "It is not charity," he said. "Haggerty let his fences go before he left. 3 of his cattle got through my fence line last fall, and I had to go 20 miles to get them back. Neighborly maintenance benefits us both." It was a practical explanation, and Ellen recognized it as such, and she also recognized that it was probably only partially true. She decided not to press the point. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He climbed down from the roof. He retrieved his tools and his horse. He was almost back to the fence line when she called after him, "Mr. Lawson." He stopped but did not turn around. "Your wife," she said. "I heard she passed 2 winters ago. I am sorry for your loss." There was a long silence. He stood with his back to her, very still. Then he turned enough that she could see his profile against the morning sky, and his expression was something she thought she recognized: grief that had been weathered down to something manageable but was not entirely gone. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was very good." He rode back to his land, and Ellen stood in the grass and watched him go, and she understood something about him then that she had not understood before. June arrived and brought with it heat that was biblical in its intensity, and Ellen worked through it. She had sent a letter to a lumber man in Wichita and received back a price list that was discouraging. The cost of milled lumber to build even a modest 1-story house was well beyond what she could currently afford. She needed money. She spent 3 days calculating, and then she made a decision. She rode into Caldwell. She had purchased a horse from Pete Gruber on credit, a steady brown mare she named Providence, and she went to see Harold Potts at the general store. She explained that she was an experienced seamstress and dressmaker, that she had worked for one of the better dressmakers in Cincinnati for 5 years, and that she was prepared to take in sewing work at competitive prices. Harold Potts looked doubtful. Roy Decker was in the store again. The man seemed to live there, and he said something under his breath that made his companion laugh. Ellen did not look at them. She kept her eyes on Harold Potts. "There are women in this town who want proper dresses made," she said. "They have the fabric and the money, and no good dressmaker closer than Wichita. I can do the work. I need the income. It benefits everyone." Harold Potts agreed to put up a notice. Within a week, Ellen had 3 clients. Within a month, she had 6. She worked on their sewing in the evenings by lamplight in the dugout, careful professional work that she had spent years perfecting, and the money began to accumulate with the slow, serious patience of someone who knows exactly what it is for. Through all of this, Louis Lawson remained at the edge of things. She would see him at his fence line sometimes, working his own land, and they would exchange brief words. He came by twice more in that first month with small practical offerings: a post-hole digger she had been struggling without, information about which section of the creek was most reliable in dry months. He gave these things in the same way he gave everything, bluntly, with no ornament, as though they were simply facts of existence that happened to be useful. She began to notice things about him. He was methodical in his work, the way she was methodical. He rose early and worked late, and he did not waste motion. His land was immaculate, not beautiful in any decorative sense, but deeply organized, the kind of organization that reflected a serious intelligence applied to practical problems. His fence lines were straight. His barn, which she could see from her property, was well constructed and well maintained. His cattle were fat and calm. She noticed also that he was lonely. Not in a way he would ever say, but in the way he sometimes paused at the fence line when she was close by, as though proximity to another human being was itself a form of sustenance that he had been going without for too long. The recognition was not sentimental. It was simply accurate. In July, on a morning when the heat had broken slightly and there was an actual cool breeze coming down from the north, Lawson appeared at her property line with a young calf behind him on a lead rope and said, "This one's mother died this morning. I cannot keep up with hand-feeding a calf and everything else. Do you want her?" Ellen looked at the calf. The calf looked at Ellen with enormous, wet eyes and made a sound of pure infant bewilderment. "What would I do with a dairy calf?" Ellen asked. "In 18 months you would have a milk cow," he said. "You are building a homestead, you need a milk cow." Ellen looked at the calf again. "And what do you want in return?" "I will teach you how to hand-feed her," he said, "and we can call it even." So Lawson came onto her property for the first time, leading a motherless calf, and spent an hour showing Ellen how to mix the warm milk substitute and how to get the calf to suckle from a cloth rag. They sat in the grass together in the morning shade of the cottonwood by the creek, and the calf's ears were soft as velvet, and it leaned its whole weight against Ellen's leg, and she actually laughed, out loud, without thinking about it. And when she looked up, she found Lawson watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not a complicated expression. It was simple and direct, and it disappeared almost immediately, replaced by his usual careful blankness. But she had seen it, and she filed it away in the same careful part of her mind where she kept all the important things. "What will you name her?" he asked. Ellen thought for a moment. "Patience," she said, "because she is going to require a great deal of it." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved in what on another face would have been a smile, and he looked down at the calf, and he said, "That is a good name." They talked for a while after that, which was something he had not done before, actual conversation beyond practical exchange. She asked him about his land, how long he had been here, where he was from. He had come from Missouri in 1869, he told her, with his wife Clara and 40 head of cattle, and the intention of building something worth building. He had expanded the herd to 200. He had built a proper house and barn. Clara had died in December of 1871 from a fever that took her in 9 days. He had no children. He said all of this in the same flat, matter-of-fact voice he used for everything, but his hands, she noticed, were clasped hard together in his lap. "She would have liked you," he said, and then seemed surprised that he had said it. Ellen said, "Why?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "Because you are not afraid of things," he said. She was not afraid of things either. Most people out here are afraid of something: the weather, the loneliness, the hard work, the land itself. Clara was not, and she did not have much patience for people who were. "You remind me of her in that way." Ellen held this very carefully because she understood it was a significant thing for him to say. "I am afraid of plenty," she said honestly. "I am afraid of failing. I am afraid of the person I would be if I went back. I am afraid of this calf getting sick before she is established." He looked at her. "That is different," he said. "That is being afraid of specific things with specific solutions. That is useful fear. I mean the kind of fear that stops people before they start." She understood the distinction. She nodded. He left that afternoon, and she stood watching Providence grazing and Patience pulling at the grass near the cottonwood, and she thought that Kansas was a stranger and more interesting place than she had expected, and that Lawson was a stranger and more interesting man than anyone in Caldwell had led her to believe. August brought a dry spell that cracked the ground in long, shallow fissures and turned the grass from green to the color of old straw. Ellen's kitchen garden suffered, and she carried water from the creek twice a day, bucket by bucket, to keep her plants alive. The work was exhausting and the heat was relentless, and she got through it by thinking about her house. She had refined the drawings considerably. She knew now, from living on the land for 3 months, exactly where the house should stand, on that slight rise, facing east to catch the morning light, with a cellar below for food storage and protection from the violent weather that swept across the plains in spring. She had revised her estimates of the lumber she would need and had been corresponding with the Wichita lumber yard about prices and delivery. She had added up her sowing income, her savings, and the value of the small wheat crop she would attempt next spring, and she could see the path to it, faint but real. She had also been thinking about what she did not know how to do, which was a considerable list. She did not know how to properly lay a foundation. She did not know the correct way to frame a wall. She did not know how to hang a door that would not warp or swing improperly. She was going to need to learn, or she was going to need help. On a Saturday in late August, she rode into Caldwell and attended the town's small church service, partly for the social contact, which she had been without for too long, and partly because she had heard that a man named Thomas Birch attended services there, and Thomas Birch had reportedly built half the solid structures in the county before his eyesight failed him. She thought he might be willing to consult. She was right. Thomas Birch was 70 years old, nearly blind, and completely delighted that someone wanted to talk to him about construction. He sat with her on the church steps after service while everyone else stood in the yard talking, and she spread her notebook drawings across his knees, and he ran his fingers over them and she described each element aloud, and he said yes to some things and made sharp corrections to others. "Your foundation will shift if you lay it that way," he said, tapping a spot in the drawing. "You need it deeper on the north side because the frost goes deeper there, and your porch beam, double it. The wind on this plane will test every joint you have and then test it again." "How do I learn to do the framing properly?" she asked. Thomas Birch thought for a moment. "You talk to Lawson," he said. "He built his own house and it has stood 6 years without a problem. He would know." Ellen looked up from the drawing. "Is he likely to help?" Thomas Birch gave her a sideways look that she thought might have had a smile behind it. "That I cannot say, but I know he is a man who respects serious effort." On the ride home she thought about what it meant to ask Lawson for that kind of help. He had been generous already in small practical ways, but what she needed now was substantial weeks of work, real expertise, real investment. She did not know if that was something she could ask. She spent a week not asking. Then a storm came in from the southwest, a genuine Kansas storm with lightning that struck 3 times within a mile of her dugout and thunder that rolled across the plain like artillery, and she sat in the earthen shelter with patience pressed against her side and thought, "I am building a house with a proper cellar, and I am starting this winter." The next morning she rode to Lawson's fence line and called across it. He came out of his barn with a look of mild surprise. She waited while he crossed his yard and came to the fence, and she said, without preamble, because she had decided that preamble was wasted on him, "I need to know how to frame a house. Thomas Birch says you built your own and it stood. I need to start construction in September so I can be in before the hard winter. I am not asking you to do it for me. I am asking you to teach me what I need to know." He looked at her for a long time. The wind moved through the grass between them. "Your land slopes to the north along the rise," he said finally. "You will need to cut the foundation posts at different lengths to compensate." She waited. "I have cattle to move to the south pasture this week," he said. "After that I can come look at the rise and tell you what you need." Ellen breathed out something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson." "Louis," he said. It was said flatly, without inflection, but it was a significant thing for him to say, and they both knew it. "Thank you, Louis," she said. He nodded and went back to his barn, and Ellen turned Providence toward home, and she felt something warm and unsteady in her chest that she told herself was simply anticipation about the house. He came the following Thursday, as he had said he would. He walked the rise with her slowly, pressing his boot heel into the earth in various places, reading the ground the way she read a piece of difficult fabric. He took a surveyor's string from his saddlebag and helped her lay out the foundation perimeter, and he talked as they worked, explaining each decision in the same flat, serious voice he used for everything, and she listened and took notes in her small book. "You want the kitchen on the south side," he said. "More light, and the warmth from cooking will carry to the parlor in winter." "I had it on the east," she said. "East is better for the morning, but south is better for the winter. In Kansas, winter matters more than morning." She changed the drawing right there, crouching in the grass at the corner of the future house, and he watched her make the notation and said, "You had already worked out most of this yourself." "I had worked out the theory," she said. "You are giving me the corrections that only come from experience." He crouched down beside her to look at the drawing, and he was close enough that she could have leaned sideways and touched his shoulder, and she did not, but she was aware of the distance in a specific way. He smelled of wood smoke and leather and outdoor air, and his hand, pointing to a spot on the drawing, was large and careful and work-roughened. "Here," he said, "your cellar entrance. If you put it where you have it drawn, it will funnel water in a heavy rain. Move it to here just off the north wall." "Yes," she said, "that makes sense." He looked at her profile. She was aware of it. She kept her eyes on the drawing. "Why Kansas?" he asked, quietly enough that it felt like a different kind of conversation. She thought about how to answer honestly. "Because it was as far as I could get on what I had," she said. "And because I did not want to do the careful, sensible thing and stay somewhere that was making me disappear." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara said something like that," he said, "when I told her Missouri had good land and we didn't need to go further. She said she wanted to go somewhere that required everything she had because she wanted to know what everything she had was worth." Ellen looked up at him then. He was looking at the drawing, but his jaw was set in a way that told her he was somewhere else for a moment, with Clara on a road heading west, with her wanting everything the frontier could demand. "She was right," Ellen said softly. He looked at her then, and the moment stretched between them like the horizon, wide and clear and without obvious edges. "Yes," he said, "she was." September arrived, and with it the beginning of the house. Ellen had enough money from the sewing work to order the first load of lumber from Wichita, and it arrived on 3 wagons that created a considerable stir in Caldwell, because everyone had to stop and watch Harold Potts stand in the street shaking his head, while Roy Decker observed loudly that the Turner woman had lost her mind and was going to have a pile of expensive lumber sitting in the Kansas grass to show for it. What Roy Decker did not see was that Louis Lawson rode over to the Turner parcel that same afternoon, tied his horse to the cottonwood, rolled up his sleeves, and picked up a length of timber. Ellen looked at him. "I did not ask you to come today." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and she understood that this was his way, that he would not announce himself or explain himself in advance, that he was simply a man who, having decided something, did it. "The foundation posts go in first," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." They worked until the light failed. The next day he came back, and the day after that, and by the end of the first week they had the foundation posts set, properly compensated for the slope as he had said, sunk deep enough against the frost as Thomas Birch had advised. Ellen's hands were sore and split from the work, and she did not mention it. Louis did not mention the fact that he was spending time away from his own land to help her build hers. They fell into a working rhythm that was efficient and almost wordless. She had learned enough from him about how he thought to anticipate the next step, and he had learned enough about her to trust that she would do a task correctly the first time if he explained it once. They lifted timber together, held joints while the other nailed, called measurements back and forth across the rising frame of what was going to be a real house. It was on an evening in the 3rd week of September, when the walls were framed to the first story, and the skeleton of the house stood against a sky going orange and purple at the horizon, that Louis Lawson stopped work, put down his tools, and looked at what they had built together. Ellen came to stand beside him. The framed walls caught the last light and threw long shadows across the grass, and she could really see, for the first time as something other than a drawing, the shape of her house. The place where the front porch would be, the width of the parlor window, the kitchen on the south side, just as he had suggested. "It is going to be beautiful," she said, and her voice was rougher than she intended. He looked at her sideways, and his expression was something she was learning to read, the careful, restrained version of feeling that was all Louis Lawson permitted himself. "It is going to be good," he said. "Beautiful and good are not always the same thing. This will be both." She looked at him then, fully and without deflection, and she said, "Why are you doing this, truly?" He was quiet for a long moment. The light changed around them, sliding from orange toward deep blue, and the first stars appeared above the eastern horizon. "Because you are doing something that matters," he said. "Because I have been standing at that fence line for 5 months watching you work harder than most men I have known, and I thought—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I thought Clara would have wanted me to be useful to someone again." Ellen felt the weight of that. She felt it in her throat and behind her eyes, and she did not let it go anywhere, because she understood that he was still navigating his way through a grief that was 2 years old but had not finished with him. "You are useful," she said. "You are the most useful person I have met since I arrived in Kansas." Something shifted in his face, and it was not quite a smile, but it was something genuine and warm, and she thought that in another life, in a different kind of man, it would have been a smile of real happiness. She turned back to the house frame and thought about windows and floors and what color she would paint the front door. October was cool and urgent. Ellen sewed in the evenings by lamplight and built her house in the days, and Louis came every afternoon, his morning work on his own spread done, and they raised walls and laid floors and talked. They talked while they worked, and she discovered things about him in the way you discover things about someone when you are doing hard physical labor together, not from formal conversation, but from the unguarded things that come out when people are concentrating on a task and their social defenses are engaged elsewhere. He had a younger brother named Daniel in Missouri who he wrote to twice a year. He had been reading the same 3 books since Clara died, because he had not been able to concentrate on new ones. He was quietly, profoundly proud of his cattle operation in a way he would never say directly, but she could hear it in the specific way he talked about his herd. He cooked his own meals, and they were plain and adequate. He had planted a garden once with Clara and not again since. She told him things in return, about the sewing room in Cincinnati and the smell of it, fabric dust and lamp oil, and the particular sound of the owner, Mrs. Hartwell, dictating to her seamstresses in a tone that admitted no mistakes. About her parents, who had died within a year of each other when she was 19, and the cousin Margaret who had taken her in and been kind in a distant way. About the magazine advertisement for Kansas land that she had cut out and kept for 4 years before she finally had enough money and enough courage to answer it. 4 years, Louis said, holding a board level while she nailed it. "You knew for 4 years. I needed to save enough," she said, "and I needed to stop talking myself out of it." "What finally made you go?" She thought about this, hammer resting against her thigh. "I made a dress," she said. "The finest dress I had ever made. Silk, 10 yards of it, a pale yellow, perfect work. It was for a woman who was getting married. She came in for the fitting, and she was so happy she cried, and I stood there with my pins and my tape measure, and I thought, I want that. Not the dress, not the wedding. I want that feeling of having something that is entirely mine that I built and being so happy about it I cry." She drove a nail. "So I went home and I wrote to the land office in Caldwell." Louis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you cry when you got here and saw what you had bought?" She laughed despite herself. "I very nearly did, but it was not the happy kind." He laughed then too. A real laugh, short and genuine, and she looked at him in surprise because she had not heard him laugh before, truly laugh, and it was a good sound, low and warm, and it changed his whole face for a moment into something younger and lighter. "But you stayed," he said. "I stayed," she said. They looked at each other for a moment over the board between them, and the afternoon light was warm on both their faces, and Ellen felt the warmth in her chest again, the unsteady thing she had been carefully not naming, and this time it was harder to put away. November brought the first real cold, and the roof went on the house in a rush of urgent work over 4 consecutive days. The two of them and Pete Gruber's teenage son, who was hired to help, working from first light to last to get the shingles laid before the weather turned. Ellen stood on the ridge of her house in a cold wind and drove the last shingle nail on the fourth evening, and Pete Gruber's son whooped from the far end of the roof, and Louis, standing on the ladder below her, looked up with an expression she had no trouble reading at all. He was proud of her. Purely, simply proud. She climbed down and her knees shook slightly from the work and the cold and the enormity of having a roof. He put out a hand without thinking, steadying her elbow, and she gripped his forearm and came down, and they stood close together on the frozen ground, breath pluming in the cold air. "It is a good roof," he said. "It is a magnificent roof," she said. "I'm going to sleep under it tonight even though there are no walls finished inside." He looked at her with something very close to alarm. "It is 25 degrees. I have 3 blankets and a good wool coat and a calf who generates remarkable amounts of body heat." "Ellen," he said, and it was the first time he had said her name without the miss before it, and they both heard it, and neither of them said anything about it. "You will freeze." "I will not freeze," she said. "I have survived in a dugout for 7 months. I am entirely capable of surviving one night in my own house with a good fire in the stone hearth we finished last week." He looked at the house. He looked at her. He said, "I will bring firewood. You are not going to have enough in there yet." She did not argue. He disappeared to his property and came back an hour later with his horse loaded with a substantial stack of dry oak, and he carried it inside and stacked it by the hearth while she lit the first fire in her house. The light of it played across the bare framed walls and the new plank floor and the raw open space that would become her parlor, and it was the most beautiful room she had ever stood in. Louis stood in the doorway after he had brought the last load of wood, and he looked at the fire and then at her face in the firelight. "This is going to be something," he said quietly. "When it is finished, this is going to be something." "It already is," she said. He left before full dark, and she slept by her fire with Patience curled nearby and Providence outside under a temporary shelter, and it was the best sleep she had in months, deep and warm and completely hers. The interior work continued through November and into December, which was brutal and beautiful by turns. Ellen hired 2 men from Caldwell to help with the heavy plastering work, paying them from her savings, and she did the finish carpentry herself, the baseboards, the window frames, the careful trim work, because she had precise hands and good eyes from years of sewing, and she did not trust the men from Caldwell with the details. Louis came on the weekends now, his weekday visits curtailed by the demands of winter cattle management. He brought practical things: a good door hinge set for the front door, a piece of advice about the root cellar drainage, twice a venison roast from a deer he had taken on his property, offered in the same flat manner as everything else, without ceremony, as a matter of course. She cooked the second roast for both of them on a Friday evening in the stone hearth, using her cast iron pot and a collection of dried herbs from her kitchen garden, and they sat on upturned crates in the nearly finished parlor and ate by firelight because the table she had ordered from a furniture maker in Wichita had not arrived yet. It was the most comfortable she had ever felt in another person's company. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but genuine, the kind that exists between people who do not need to fill space with words. They had spent enough hours working side by side that they had passed the stage of social performance and arrived at something more honest. After dinner, he stayed longer than usual, and they talked until the fire burned low. He told her about the winter he and Clara had spent in their first year on the land, in a sod house not unlike her dugout, and how Clara had somehow made it feel cheerful with colored cloth hung over the earthen walls. He told it without the careful distance he usually maintained about his memories of Clara, and Ellen listened, and she thought that grief was a strange country that you moved through at your own pace, and that perhaps he was finally beginning to find his way through some of the harder country in it. "She would have wanted me to be happy," he said, and it came out of nowhere in the middle of a silence, and he seemed surprised to hear himself say it. Ellen looked at the dying fire. "And are you," she asked carefully, "happy?" He did not answer right away. She heard him breathe. She heard the pop of a settling ember. "More than I was," he said. "Since you came here." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, his elbows on his knees, and he did not look at her when he said it, which was its own kind of honesty. Her heart did something complicated and necessary. "I am glad," she said very quietly. "You have given me more practical assistance than I can reasonably account for, and considerably more than that." He did look at her then. "What do you mean?" "You made this feel possible," she said. "When I came here in April, I was terrified underneath the part that was not. I would not have told anyone that, but it is true. And having a person across the fence line who took what I was doing seriously, not as a curiosity or an eccentricity, but as a legitimate thing that mattered more than I can easily say." He was very still. The firelight was low and orange on his face, and he was watching her with those dark gray eyes that she had stopped finding difficult to meet. "Ellen," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said. "I find," he started again and stopped again, and she could see the effort it took him, this man who kept everything interior to bring something exterior. "I find that my land feels different than it did 6 months ago," he said finally. "Not the land itself, but the knowledge of what is on the other side of my fence line." She understood him precisely. "So does mine," she said. They looked at each other in the last of the firelight, and the thing between them that had been building through months of shared work and accumulated honesty was present in the room as clearly as the furniture that was not yet there. And she thought he might say something more, might bridge the distance that was still between them, but he was a man who moved at his own pace, and she was a woman who had learned patience. And so she let the moment be what it was. He left shortly after. She sat by the cooling fire for a long time. December completed the interior of the house. The table arrived from Wichita, and with it 4 chairs. Ellen ordered curtain fabric through Harold Potts and made the curtains herself, deep red for the parlor, practical white for the kitchen, a soft blue for the bedroom she was planning to use. She hung them herself, standing on a step stool she had built from scrap timber, and when they were hung she stood back in the center of her parlor and turned around slowly and looked at everything she had made. The walls were plastered smooth and whitewashed. The floors were oak plank, sanded to a warm finish. The windows, 4 of them on the ground floor, real glass, the most expensive single item she had purchased, let in the winter light at angles that moved through the room as the day progressed. The kitchen had its good iron stove, ordered from a catalog and installed in October, and the cellar below was packed with stored garden produce and the smoked meat she had put up in the fall. The front porch was finished with its railing, and from it she could see across the frozen winter grass all the way to Louis Lawson's barn on the neighboring property. She went to Caldwell on a Monday in mid-December, and she walked into Harold Potts's store with her head up, and Roy Decker was there as he always was, and several other men she recognized, and she purchased a few things she needed, and then she said, to no one in particular but loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear, "If anyone is curious about the house on the Turner parcel, they are welcome to come for a look. I believe it may be the finest new construction in the county." Roy Decker opened his mouth. Harold Potts, to his credit, was already nodding. "I heard the frame went up very fast," Harold said. "It did," Ellen agreed. "Good planning and better help." Roy Decker said, "I heard Louis Lawson spent half his fall over on your place." Ellen picked up her purchases. "Mr. Lawson is a remarkable builder and a generous neighbor," she said. "Good morning, gentlemen." She rode home in the winter sunlight feeling something that she finally let herself name: happiness. Not the desperate, white-knuckled happiness of survival, but the deep-rooted kind, the kind that lives in a place you have built yourself and stays. That evening she wrote a letter to her cousin Margaret in Cincinnati. "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "I want you to know that I am alive. In fact, I am considerably more than alive. I have 160 acres of Kansas land, a kitchen garden, a milk cow named Patience, a mare named Providence, a root cellar full of food for the winter, and the finest frame house in Caldwell County. They told me I would not survive the frontier. I built the finest home in the county to disagree. I hope you are well. Your cousin, Ellen Turner. She sealed the letter with satisfaction and set it on the kitchen table to post in the morning. She was standing on her front porch looking at the stars when she heard hoofbeats and saw the familiar dark shape of Louis Lawson's horse picking its way across the frozen ground toward her fence line. She watched him approach, and when he reached the fence she could see he was carrying something across his saddle, a small spruce tree cut and bundled. "Christmas is next week," he said. "I thought," he paused. "Clara always had a tree. I have not cut one since, but I thought this year," he stopped again. Ellen looked at the small tree. She looked at him in the starlight, this careful, serious man who held everything he felt behind a wall of practicality, holding a Christmas tree across his saddle because he had thought she might want one. "Louis," she said, "will you come inside? I have coffee on the stove." He looked at her for a moment. He dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post and lifted the tree over the wire. They carried it inside together and stood it in the corner of the parlor in a bucket of water. And she had no ornaments yet, but she had colored thread from her sewing work, and they made small bows from it and hung them on the branches. And it was ridiculous and impractical and lovely. And they stood back to look at it, and the red curtains and the warm light from the oil lamp and the plank floors she had sanded herself. "You did this," Louis said. It was not a casual observation. It was a full statement of something he meant deeply. "We did this," she said. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and the distance between them in the lamplight was about 3 feet, and she thought it was probably the last time in her life it would be that much, and she was right. "I want to court you properly," he said, in his blunt, direct way, "if you will allow it. I have been standing at that fence line for 8 months, and I am tired of it being a fence line." Ellen felt warmth move through her from her chest to her fingertips. "There are 1 or 2 other women in Caldwell who have expressed interest in your attentions," she said, because she could not help it. He looked faintly pained. "I'm not interested in 1 or 2 other women in Caldwell." "I know," she said. "I was teasing you." He blinked, and then something happened on his face that she had been waiting for since July, a real, full smile startled out of him by her teasing, warm and genuine and remarkable on his stern features, and she thought, there he is. There is the man underneath all that careful management. "Yes," she said, "you may court me. I think we have perhaps been courting for some time already, but yes." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first deliberate physical contact they had shared that was not practical, and his hand was warm and careful and steady around hers, and she gripped it back. "Good," he said. They drank coffee by the Christmas tree, and he stayed until midnight, and they talked with the ease of people who have already shared 8 months of themselves and are only now catching up to what that means. And when he left, he stood on her front porch for a moment in the cold and held both her hands and looked at her as though memorizing something important. "I will come for dinner on Christmas," he said. "If you will have me." "I will have you," she said. He rode home in the starlight, and she stood on her porch and watched him go. And then she went inside and stood in the center of her house, her floor, her walls, her windows, her curtains, her hearth, and pressed both hands to her face and breathed. January was cold and relentless and absolutely perfect in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Louis came to her property every evening, tying his horse at the fence and walking to her front door. And he knocked even though she could see him coming from 20 minutes away, and always had the coffee ready, because he was a man who believed in doing things correctly. He brought things, books he thought she might like, a set of good kitchen knives he had ordered from a Wichita catalog, once a small painting of a Kansas landscape done by a woman in Caldwell who had some talent for it and needed the money. He was a man of practical devotion, and she adored it. She cooked for him. She was a good cook, not fancy, but solid and satisfying. And she liked the way he ate, with genuine appreciation, and none of the self-consciousness that some men had around a woman who was capable. He told her she cooked better than he did, which was a higher compliment than it sounded, because she had discovered that Louis Lawson's cooking was actually quite good. They walked her land on the evenings when the cold was not too bitter, and he talked to her about the spring planting plan she was developing, offering corrections and suggestions in his matter-of-fact way. She was planning a proper crop of winter wheat on the bottom acreage, which the soil analysis she had done, with the help of a pamphlet from the Kansas State Agricultural College, suggested would produce well. She had also been corresponding with a seed merchant in Kansas City about a variety of corn that was better suited to the dry Kansas summers. Louis listened to all of this and made precise, useful observations, and she listened to him talk about his cattle operation and understood that it was equally precise and considered, and she thought that they were well matched in the specific way that mattered most. They were both serious people. On a Thursday evening in the middle of January, they were sitting in her parlor after dinner, and he was reading the agricultural pamphlet while she worked on a piece of sewing, and the oil lamp cast a warm circle of light around them both, and the wind was howling outside with real purpose, and the house held against it without so much as a creak, solid and well built, and Ellen looked up from her sewing and looked at his profile bent over the pamphlet and thought, "I am in love with this man." It was not a sudden realization. It was more like the end of a long sentence she had been reading for months and had now arrived at the period. She looked at him for a moment, noting the things she loved specifically, the careful way he turned a page, the slight furrow between his brows when he was thinking hard, the way he had pushed his boots off at the door because her floors were good floors and he respected them, the way he had looked at her Christmas tree with the same expression he used when looking at something he found genuinely valuable. She looked back at her sewing and smiled at it. He looked up and caught the tail end of the smile. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "The sewing." He looked at the sewing, which was a perfectly ordinary piece of mending. "That is not a sewing face," he said. She looked up and she was still smiling, and she said, "I am happy, Louis. That is all." He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved and his eyes did the thing they did when he felt more than he said, and he looked back at the pamphlet and said, very quietly, "So am I." February was when he asked her to marry him, and he did it in the least romantic and most perfectly him way possible. They were in her root cellar assessing the winter stores, which was an entirely necessary task, and he was holding the lamp while she counted jars, and he said, in the same voice he used for fence repair and cattle figures, "I think we should get married." She stopped counting. She looked at him in the lamplight. He was looking at the shelves of preserved food with an expression of considerable determination, as though he had said something reasonable that was waiting for a reasonable response. "Louis," she said. "Yes," he said, still looking at the shelves. "Will you look at me, please?" He turned and looked at her. His jaw was set. His eyes were absolutely honest. "I am 31 years old," he said, "and I have been lonely for 2 years, and I did not think I would not be lonely for some time more, and then you came over that fence line and I was wrong. You are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and I would very much like to marry you if you will have me." Ellen set down her counting book. She crossed the 3 steps between them in the root cellar and stood in front of him, and she put her hand on his face, and he held very still, and she said, "That is the most wonderful root cellar proposal I have ever received." Something shifted in his face. "It is the only root cellar proposal you have received." "Yes," she said. "And it is still wonderful. Yes, Louis, I will marry you," he exhaled. It was a very significant exhale, the kind that carries 2 years of contained wanting, and he put his arms around her and held her with the same focused, practical devotion he brought to everything he did, and she felt the solidity of him, the warmth, the sheer reliability of a man who built things to last. They got married in April of 1874, on the 1-year anniversary of Ellen's arrival in Caldwell, Kansas, in the small church where she had first spoken to Thomas Birch. The ceremony was attended by most of the town, because both of them were, in different ways, people who Caldwell had been watching with interest, and because people love a wedding on the frontier the way they love anything that asserts life against the enormity of the land. Harold Potts was there. Pete Gruber was there, beaming with something very close to paternal satisfaction. Thomas Birch was there, mostly blind and thoroughly pleased, leaning on a cane and saying "I told you so" to no one in particular. Even Roy Decker was there, somewhat chastened, because the Turner house had become, as the winter wore on, exactly what Ellen had said it would be: the finest home in the county, and everyone who had driven past it on the road east out of Caldwell knew it. Ellen wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with a fitted bodice and careful lace trim she had ordered from Kansas City, and she carried a small bunch of the first wild flowers of the Kansas spring, which she had picked herself that morning from the edge of her property. She walked into the church alone because she had no family to walk with her, and she walked with her head up and her eyes on Louis, who was standing at the front in a clean suit he had made in Wichita, and who was watching her walk toward him with an expression so unguarded and full that half the women in the church teared up without quite knowing why. He took her hands at the altar and held them, and the preacher said the words, and Louis said his in that clear, flat voice that she loved for its honesty, and she said hers, and when the preacher said he could kiss his bride, Louis did so with considerable intention, and several people in the back pews applauded. They celebrated afterward at the house, her house, their house, which was large enough to hold 20 people in the parlor and the kitchen together, and the women from Caldwell who had hired her sewing work brought food, and someone brought a fiddle player, and there was dancing on the front porch in the April evening, while Patience the milk cow watched from the yard with philosophical calm. At some point in the evening, Ellen found herself standing at the edge of the porch looking out over her land in the gathering dark, and Louis came to stand beside her, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. "1 year," she said. "1 year," he agreed. She looked at the rise of her house against the evening sky, at the glass windows catching the lamplight from inside, at the solid walls and good roof, and the plank porch floor they had built together. She looked at the kitchen garden, dormant still, but waiting for the spring planting she would do next week. She looked at the bottom acreage where the winter wheat would go in, and the fences she had repaired to proper condition, and the cottonwood by the creek where she had first crouched with a wash bucket and heard Louis Lawson's voice for the first time. "They told me I would not survive this," she said. Louis looked at the house. "They were wrong," he said. "Thoroughly," she agreed. He pulled her a little closer, and the fiddle music came out through the front door, and someone laughed inside, and the Kansas night was enormous and cold and beautiful around them, and Ellen Turner Lawson stood on the porch of the finest house in Caldwell County and let herself be completely, irreversibly happy. Spring of 1874 brought the wheat in, and it was a good crop, not remarkable but solid, and she sold enough of it to fund the next phase of her plans, which were considerable. She wanted to expand the kitchen garden into a proper market garden. She wanted to add a summer kitchen off the back of the house, and she wanted, eventually, to have a second-story bedroom for the children she hoped would come. Louis moved his operation to her property, their property, bringing his cattle to the better bottomland pastures on the Lawson side and the east fields on the Turner side, and his horse and equipment to the barn they built together that summer, a proper timber frame structure that was a match for the house in quality. He kept his original homestead land under his name as an extension of their combined operation, and together they had over 300 acres of some of the better managed land in the county. He was a good husband, which surprised no one who had paid attention to the kind of man he was. He was steady and honest and present in the specific ways that mattered, and he listened to her plans with the same serious attention he gave to his own, and he offered his opinion directly and without condescension, and accepted her disagreement the same way. They argued sometimes. She was not a woman who avoided argument, and he was not a man who backed down easily, but they argued fairly, and they almost always arrived somewhere better than either of them had started. There were harder things, too, as there always were on the frontier. A drought that summer burned half the corn crop and strained their finances significantly. A cattle illness came through the county in August, and they lost 7 head, and spent 2 anxious weeks watching the rest of the herd, with Louis riding the pastures at dawn and dusk with the careful, contained worry of a man who loved his animals and would not show panic but would also not rest until he was certain. Ellen managed the household accounts with surgical precision during those weeks, reworking every figure to find the money they would need if the losses continued, and presented Louis with a clear picture one evening at the kitchen table that neither of them loved but both of them could work with. He had looked at her figures and then at her face and said, "We are going to be all right." "Yes," she said, "we are." And they were. By the fall of 1874, the crisis had passed. The cattle recovered, the remaining crops were sold at decent prices, and Ellen's sewing work, she had not stopped taking clients, because she was not a woman who stopped doing things that worked brought in a steady supplemental income that continued to matter. She had also, that summer, begun taking sewing students, 3 young women from Caldwell who wanted to learn the trade. She taught them on Tuesday afternoons in her kitchen, and she was good at teaching clear and precise and demanding without unkindness, and 2 of them went on to take in their own professional work within the year. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October, going over her student lesson plans for the week, when she realized she was going to have a baby. She sat with this knowledge for a few minutes in the October morning light, the lesson plans forgotten, and then she pressed her hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed and thought about what it meant, and felt a happiness so large it was physically difficult to contain. She told Louis that evening. She had made a better dinner than usual: roasted chicken, which was a special occasion meal, and apple pie from the dried apples in the cellar, and he had noticed the extra effort and was already watchful when she told him. His face went through several things very quickly. She watched them pass: surprise, then something that broke open like weather, then a full and undefended happiness that was the most she had ever seen him show at once. He got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and crouched down so he was at eye level with her, and he took her face in his hands, very carefully, the way he held things he was afraid of dropping. "Ellen," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was crying a little, which she had not expected. Are you certain?" "Yes," she said, "quite certain." He pressed his forehead against hers, and they stayed that way for a long moment in the kitchen light, and she could feel him breathing, and she thought, "This is the house I built. This is the life I built. This is what it was for." The baby came in June of 1875 on a morning when the prairie was in its full summer beauty, and it was a boy. Louis stood in the kitchen doorway while the midwife from Caldwell worked, and his face was completely undone in a way she had never seen. And when Mrs. Hennessy, the midwife, put the baby in his arms, Louis stood holding his son with an expression so raw and good that Ellen, exhausted and triumphant, started crying again. They named him James, for no family reason, but simply because it was a solid, honest name that fit a solid, honest life. James Lawson was a red-faced, loud, determined baby who immediately communicated that he had strong opinions about everything, which Ellen thought was entirely appropriate. Louis held him every evening, sitting in the parlor chair he had brought from his original house, which was one of the few things he had kept from that previous life, and he talked to James in a low voice about cattle and wheat and the quality of the Kansas soil, which was not conventional baby conversation, but which James seemed to find perfectly satisfactory. The county took notice of the Lawson place, as Ellen had intended it would. She had not come to Kansas to be invisible. She had come to prove something, and the proof was now documented in every solid plank, every glass window, every straight fence line on the Turner-Lawson acreage. When the County Agricultural Society held its annual review of homesteads in the fall of 1875, the Lawson place was noted in their report as among the finest managed properties in the region, and Ellen was the first woman specifically named in the report as a significant contributor to a homestead's development. She put the report in a frame and hung it in the parlor, not from vanity but from a sense that it mattered to have the record. Margaret's voice, that Cincinnati cousin voice full of worried certainty that Ellen would fail, deserved a precise and documented refutation. Roy Decker stopped her on the street in Caldwell that fall and said, somewhat painfully, that he had to admit he had been wrong in his initial assessment of her prospects. Ellen smiled at him and said she appreciated the admission and that she hoped he would share his revised opinion with anyone who might still be skeptical. Roy Decker went slightly red and touched his hat and moved along, and Ellen went into Harold Potts's store and bought baby flannel for James's winter clothes and exchanged cheerful conversation with Harold, who had long since come around to genuine admiration for both her enterprise and her seamstress work, which had become quite renowned in the county. The winter of 1875 was easier than the previous ones because they were more prepared for it. The root cellar was well stocked. The house was warm. James grew from a red-faced newborn into a round, serious baby who sat up straight and looked at the world with Louis's gray eyes and Ellen's stubborn assessment. And both of them thought privately that this combination was going to produce a formidable person. On Christmas of 1875, they had a proper Christmas dinner with a table full of people. Pete Gruber and his wife, Thomas Birch, who was now nearly fully blind but cheerful beyond any reasonable cause, 2 of Ellen's sewing students and their families, and 3 of the neighboring farm families who had become genuine friends over the 2 years of working and living alongside each other. The parlor was full of voices and the smell of good food, and the Christmas tree was decorated with real glass ornaments that Ellen had ordered from a catalog in Kansas City. And James sat on Louis's knee at the head of the table and was passed from arm to arm with the contentment of a baby who has figured out that life contains a great deal of warmth. Louis caught Ellen's eye across the table over the heads of their guests, and he raised his glass of cider to her, and she raised hers, and it was the most private and complete conversation they had all evening. In the spring of 1876, Ellen began the second story of the house. It was the part she had always planned, the room she had drawn in her notebook in Cincinnati, and now she had the money and the knowledge and the husband to build it. They did most of the work together, as they had done everything, with Louis doing the heavy framing and Ellen the finish work, and Pete Gruber's son, no longer a teenager but a capable young man of 20, hired for 2 weeks to help with the roof extension. The second story added 2 bedrooms and a proper linen closet, which was a luxury that made Ellen extremely happy in a specific and practical way. The master bedroom looked east, toward the morning light, with a view across the Kansas plain that was, in the right seasons, heartbreakingly beautiful. She put a rocking chair by the window and a good wool rug on the floor, and a writing desk in the corner where she did her accounts and her correspondence, and she felt, settling into this room, the final completion of something she had been building for a very long time. James's room was across the hall. Louis painted it with a pale yellow wash, which he did without telling her he was going to do it, and when she went to see what he was doing up there one afternoon and found the room glowing with that warm color, she stood in the doorway and her hand went to her mouth. "Clara's color," Louis said from across the room, brush in hand. He said it gently and directly, because they had learned to speak that way about Clara, not around her but through her, because Clara was part of how Louis had become who he was, and who he was who Ellen loved. "I thought she deserved a place in the house," he said, "in a good way." Ellen crossed the room and took the brush from him and kissed him, right there in the half-painted room, and he held her with paint on his hands and a slight smile against her hair. "It is perfect," she said. James grew to be a toddler with his mother's determination and his father's economy of motion. And in the fall of 1877, when he was 2, they found they were expecting again. This time it was a girl, born in March of 1878, with dark hair and gray eyes, and a very specific expression of assessment that belonged to both of them equally and would become well known in Caldwell County over the years. They named her Clara. Louis sat very still when Ellen suggested it, and then he looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at Ellen with something in his eyes that went back years and was now very close to healed, and he said yes. Clara Lawson was, from the beginning, entirely herself. She and James were friends and adversaries in the complex way of siblings close in age, and the house was loud with them in a way that neither Ellen nor Louis had ever experienced before, and both of them found they could not imagine living without. The cattle operation grew. The wheat fields expanded. Ellen's market garden became, by 1878, a real commercial enterprise. She sold produce to 3 of the Caldwell stores and had a standing arrangement with the hotel kitchen that had opened on the main street the year before. Her sewing work she had passed on largely to her students now, keeping only the most complex or interesting commissions for herself, and she was using the time she reclaimed to manage the garden accounts and the crop planning and the household finances, which she had always done, and which she did with a precision that Louis respected entirely. Thomas Birch died in the winter of 1878 at the age of 73, peacefully and with reasonable preparation, and Ellen sat with him in his final weeks because he had given her the foundation of her house in his knowledge, and she did not think that kind of debt should go unacknowledged. He died with his mind clear and his opinions intact, and a genuine satisfaction in the things he had built and helped others build, and Ellen thought that was an admirable way to go. Pete Gruber's boy married one of Ellen's sewing students in 1879, and they held the wedding at the Lawson place because the house was the finest venue in the county and everyone knew it, and Ellen stood on her front porch watching the dancing in the yard and felt that specific pleasure that comes from a place becoming something larger than just your own life. Louis came to stand beside her, as he always did. James was in his arms, nearly 4 years old and fighting sleep with the determination of a boy who believes he is missing something important. Little Clara was already asleep inside, carried up by Louis's mother who had come from Missouri the previous summer to meet her grandchildren and had, to everyone's surprise including her own, decided to stay. Catherine Lawson was 60, small, angular, and entirely delighted by Ellen, in a way she expressed through constant practical assistance and occasional blunt commentary on things she felt could be improved. Ellen adored her. Louis viewed this development with the wariness of a man who loves 2 capable women and has learned that they will form opinions about him in each other's company, which was entirely accurate. Catherine had taken the second guest room on the 2nd floor, and she sat with the children on the mornings Ellen was in the garden, and she showed Ellen a way of preserving corn that was better than the method Ellen had been using, which Ellen adopted immediately without sentiment, because better methods were better methods. James fell asleep in his father's arms on the porch, weight entirely given over to unconscious trust, and Louis shifted him to a more comfortable hold with the ease of a man who had been carrying a growing child for years. "Happy?" Louis asked, the same question she had asked him once by a dying fire in the first winter. "Thoroughly," she said. He looked at the yard full of dancing people, at the house behind them with its lamplit windows and its solid 2nd story, at the land around them in the spring dark, and he said, "It is a good life." "It is the best life," she said. He turned and kissed her temple, warm and deliberate, and James made a small sleeping sound of protest, and in the distance the fiddle music rose into the Kansas night. The years that followed were full ones. The children grew with the land. James at 7 was already at his father's heel on the cattle work, asking questions with Ellen's precision and taking notes in a small book she had given him because she was her mother's son. Clara at 5 was in Ellen's garden, learning the names of things with Louis's careful seriousness. The house expanded again in 1881 with a proper summer kitchen that Ellen had been planning since 1875, and a larger barn that accommodated the herd, which had grown to 400 head. The market garden was managed by a hired woman named Rosa Garza, who had come up from the south with her husband and 2 children, and had found in Caldwell a place that was harder than expected and more possible than she had been told, which Ellen recognized entirely and acted on by offering Rose fair wages, good conditions, and practical solidarity. In 1882, the county seat commissioned a painting of the landmark properties of Caldwell County, and the Lawson homestead was among the 6 properties selected. The painter came out on a Tuesday in late summer and set up his easel at the east fence line, and painted the house and the barn and the kitchen garden and the fields beyond, and Ellen stood beside Louis watching the work progress, and she felt the thing she always felt when she looked at her house from the outside, the deep, satisfied certainty of a person who has built exactly what they intended. The painting was displayed in the courthouse, and people from all over the county saw it, and more than one woman who was considering the move to Kansas stopped and looked at it and thought, if she could do that, perhaps there is something in what the magazines are saying about land out west. Ellen did not know about those women, but if she had, she would have been glad, because she had not come to Kansas just to build her own house. She had come to find out what she was capable of, and what she had found was that capability was not a private thing. It radiated outward, it showed. It gave other people permission to want what they wanted and try what they were afraid to try. She wrote to Margaret again in Cincinnati in the summer of 1882, a proper long letter this time that included a description of the house, the garden, the children, Louis, Catherine Lawson, Rosa Garza, and the county painting in the courthouse. She wrote it sitting at her desk in the second-story bedroom, looking east over the Kansas plain in the morning light, and she wrote it with the pleased, generous warmth of a woman who has nothing left to prove and knows it. Margaret wrote back within a month. Her letter was warm and somewhat wonderstruck, and contained the sentence, "I think of you often when I feel afraid of something, and I tell myself about you, and it helps." Ellen read this sentence 3 times, and then folded the letter and put it in the small tin box where she kept the things she wanted to keep. Louis came up to find her at her desk as he often did in the evening, the children in bed below, the house quiet around them, and he sat on the edge of the desk the way he had developed the habit of doing in recent years, close enough to rest his hand on her shoulder if he wanted to, which he usually did. "Letter from Margaret?" he asked. "She says I inspire her," Ellen said. Louis looked at her with the small, warm gravity he had when he was about to say something true. "She is not wrong," he said. Ellen leaned back in her chair and looked up at him and felt the accumulated weight of everything: the sewing room in Cincinnati, the stagecoach ride, the first sight of her dugout, the fence line, the Christmas tree, the root cellar proposal, the house going up in September light, 2 children sleeping down the hall, a husband sitting on her desk in a lamplit room, and she thought that it was a life so complete and so completely hers that she could not have drawn it better in any notebook. "I am 41 years old," she said, "and I have the finest house in Caldwell County, the best husband in Kansas, 2 remarkable children, a mother-in-law who taught me to preserve corn correctly, and more than I dreamed of when I bought this land. And they told me I would not last a month." Louis looked down at her with those dark gray eyes that she had known for 9 years and still found entirely worth looking at. "What would you like to do next?" He asked because he was the kind of man who knew that a woman like Ellen Turner Lawson was always building the next thing, and who loved her for it. She thought for a moment. The Kansas night was enormous outside the window, full of stars, the same stars she had looked at alone on her front porch in the first winter, but different now because she was not alone and had not been for a long time. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the schoolhouse." He raised an eyebrow. The children in the outlying farms east of Caldwell have to travel too far to town for school, she said. If we donated the east corner parcel, the piece along the road, the 3 acres that are too stony for crop use, and helped organize the build, there could be a proper school out here within 2 years. Louis looked at her for a long moment. 3 acres is not a small donation. No, she said, but James will need a schoolhouse he can reach in less than 2 hours, and so will Clara, and so will the Garza children, and so will every family who settles east of town in the next decade, because land out here is going to keep selling and there will be more families. He was quiet for a moment, working through it in his methodical way. Then he said, we would need to organize the other landowners east of town to contribute to the build. Yes, she said, and find a teacher. Yes. I have a candidate in mind, one of my original sewing students. She is very bright and she has been teaching informally already. He looked at her profile in the lamplight and she could feel him looking the way you can feel the attention of someone who knows you precisely. You have been planning this for some time, he said. Since last winter, she admitted. He was quiet again. Then he put his hand on her shoulder, warm and deliberate. All right, he said. 3 acres and we help organize the build. She looked up at him and she was smiling, and he was doing the thing with the corner of his mouth that was his version of the same thing, and they were, as they had always been from the fence line on, exactly matched. And Louis, she said, yes, I think I would like another child. He went very still for a moment, and then the careful containment broke and he smiled, a full, real smile. The same startled warmth she had first seen when she teased him about the Christmas proposal, but deeper now, rooted in years of happiness, and he said, so would I. Their 3rd child was born in the spring of 1883, another boy, healthy and loud, and they named him Thomas, for the old builder who had given Ellen the foundation of her house and who deserved to be remembered in it. Thomas Birch would have been pleased, and everyone in Caldwell said so, and they were right. The schoolhouse on the east parcel went up in 1884, built by a coalition of 7 East County families with Louis Lawson doing the framing and Ellen Turner Lawson, managing the organization, money, and considerable force of personality, required to make 7 farm families agree on anything for long enough to build something. It was a good, solid 1-room schoolhouse with a proper floor and real windows and a cast iron stove, and it opened in September of 1884 with 18 students, and Ellen's former sewing student Miss Kathleen Marsh as teacher, and James Lawson was among the first students, aged 9, sitting in the front row with his notebook and his father's gray eyes, and his mother's absolute refusal to miss anything important. The evening it opened, Louis and Ellen drove out to the schoolhouse alone after the day's celebration was done, and they stood in the empty room with the September light coming through the new windows and the chalk still on the board from that morning's lessons, and Ellen pressed her hand against the doorframe the way she had pressed her hand against her own doorframe on the day the house was finished. One more thing built, she said. Yes, Louis said from behind her, and his arms came around her from behind, and she leaned back against him in the quiet schoolroom, this man who had once been a solitary figure on the other side of a fence line, who had crossed to her side and never really crossed back. I love you, she said simply, because it was true and it was the only important thing. I know, he said, which was Louis, for I love you so entirely that stating it seems insufficient, but since you have said it I will say, Ellen, you are the best thing that has happened to me in this life, and I would cross 100 fence lines to get to where you are, and I intend to spend the remaining years of my life making sure you know it. She turned in his arms and looked at him in the September light, at the weathered, honest face she knew as well as her own land, and she thought, yes, this is it. This is what it was all for. They drove home in the gathering dark, side by side on the wagon seat, the way they had driven 1,000 times across the Kansas plain, and the house came into view ahead of them as the last light faded 2 stories, solid and square. The windows lit from within where Catherine Lawson was keeping the 3 children, and had undoubtedly already told them they would not be put to bed until their parents returned, because she believed in the children being present in their own lives, which was an opinion Ellen entirely shared. The house stood against the darkening sky exactly as she had drawn it in her notebook in Cincinnati, in that sewing room where she had been slowly disappearing, and it was better than the drawing. It was better because it was real, and because it had taken everything she had to build it, and because the man beside her had helped her build it, and because her children were inside it, and because the schoolhouse she had built on her east parcel was already full of the future, and because the finest home in Caldwell County was not an argument she had won against the people who doubted her. It was a gift she had given to herself, and it kept giving. She squeezed Louis's arm. "Home," she said. "Home," he agreed. And the horses turned up the drive without being told, because they had made this turn 1,000 times, and the house windows were warm and full of light, and the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars. And Ellen Turner Lawson drove up to the front of the finest house she had ever seen and knew, with the complete and settled certainty of someone who has built something that will last long after her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.